have you all introduce yourselves and tell us your name, tell us the company that you're working for, tell us an interesting thing that they're doing, that your company is doing with respect to IoT tech. We'll start right here with you, Alan.
Cool. My name is Ellen Sue. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Wellinks. We are a wearable medical device company focused on monitoring compliance and improving compliance with people who have orthotic and prosthetic devices. I know it's like a mouthful. So what that means is we have people who are wearing back braces, knee braces, foot braces, all sorts of things. We make sure that they're wearing their braces, and we make sure that they're fitting correctly. And then communicating that via Bluetooth to a mobile phone, uploading that to the cloud database, and sending that to their doctors and caregivers as well. Right now we work with kids who have scoliosis, so we measure if they're wearing the brace, and we try and encourage them to wear the brace more with mobile apps and software features so that they can avoid having spinal fusion surgery.
Okay, thank you. Sai.
Yeah, my name's Dhanak. I'm the director of product at Latch, which we're actually just a few blocks away. I guess at Latch we believe in two things, and these are the interesting things that we're working on. One is we think that in 2-3 years you'll order groceries while you're at work. When you get home, they'll be already stocked in your fridge. And the way we think that will happen is by building a access infrastructure that is made up of hardware and software. So we build the hardware and software, smart locks, smart readers, software for apps and web apps that allow service providers such as Amazon, FedEx, Whole Foods, dog walkers, friends, family to get in wherever they need to get in. So that's like one of the interesting things we're working on. We currently work with Walmart, Jet, and major national carriers across the United States. So a lot of buildings in New York now have Latch. And then the second piece that we're working on is keyless. We believe in the keyless future. So we believe that over the years you'll begin to see keys become less and less and be replaced by apps, wearables, even sort of codes, biometrics, things like that. So those are the two things that we're working on.
Okay, thanks.
We also use Bluetooth. It's a joy to work with.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. My name is Andrew Askedall, and I'm the Senior Director of Product Design at Makerbot. And for those of you who don't know Makerbot, we're a 3D printing company. We've been around for almost 9 years, and we released the first sort of connected 3D printers with camera, Wi-Fi, Ethernet, USB. And we're kind of like on a mission that there's an innovator in everyone, and we hope there'll be like a printer on everyone's desk. So it's basically it.
We have Jim from Makerbot, who's our head of electrical.
Oh, really?
Jim
Gripspot?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You should.
yeah, we've had like 1,000 people come through the Makerbot office in like the 10 years it's been
Yeah,
around,
yeah.
which is wild.
Yeah, you guys work on some fascinating stuff.
Oh, thanks.
I have a replicator single sitting in my office.
Oh, that's amazing. It's old school. Yeah.
Old school.
Yeah.
So I'm Patrick Way. I work with Intersection. We build the Link NYC Wi-Fi kiosks that are around the city. Those same Wi-Fi kiosks are also being deployed in the UK right now, and there are also future deployments in other cities that are coming up this year. So much of what we do is we put these sort of hardened municipal Wi-Fi things out to provide connectivity, telephone and internet access to sort of the community at large.
Okay, thank you. So this one was kind of like a round robin, everybody shared it. But what I'll do next is we'll have some general questions, and I will pick somebody at random to start, and then anybody else who wants to jump in and answer the question may. And if you don't have anything to say, that's all right too. So this one is staying pretty high level. What have been the biggest technological innovations in IoT thus far in 2017? Sorry, thus far since 2017, so I guess we're about 4 months into 2018 now. Andrew, why don't we start with you?
I shouldn't have eye contact with you. I saw it. I'm just amazed by the sort of ubiquity of these devices that are sort of always listening, and the rapid pace it seems like they're being adopted, like with no fear of privacy and everything. Like my aunt, who is not a technical person at all, she has her Apple Watch. It's almost become like a status symbol of that. But that thing being like connected to almost everything in your home. It's a huge leap forward. It's going to like definitely push other things to connect to it as well. But how they all connect to each other, I think that's still a very up in the air thing. Home kits and all those other protocols and things like that. But that's been probably like the biggest thing, and like just always having a device on you. But that's been around since like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It still feels.
I mean, I would second that. I mean, like what we found looking at voice, and this is not for Link NYC, but this is in other areas of our business. We sort of see voice as opening up computing, putting computing in social spaces where previously like it would be impractical or unusual to have computing. And so voice is something that works in the kitchen. It works on a dinner table. It works in a living room. Like there's spaces where voice works. It works in a conference room. It works in all these social spaces that it doesn't get in the way of social interactions. There's something very compelling about that. And the other thing that we're sort of very excited about when we look at voice is the way that, it very much seems to be kind of like in an Apple IIe sort of stage. Like there's these initial deployments of voice. Alexa is great, but it's that much better than Siri, and there's some things that seem to be really compelling about Google Home that are that much more compelling. But it's like it seems like every iteration of voice is really sort of expanding the notion of, everyone's very careful about it, but then it's also radically transforming, what can be done with it.
I have to say, just before we continue, Ellen, that my Google Home is really self-conscious and listening in there, so.
Oh, so it's my wake up and
It's good at some things.
So for example, my son, actually, my 5-year-old engages with Alexa in ways that, even before he's using an iPad.
I heard they make children, I don't have children, but I heard they make them ruder because you don't say please or thank you.
We actually,
It
it
does teach strong diction though.
Okay.
I
Enunciation.
have questions.
Oh yeah, please
For
do.
the panel. So I do not have a smart home device, and I don't really intend to get one. Part of my concern is, how do you guys feel about the right to privacy, the new laws that were recently passed in Europe about the right to be forgotten, the right to, not be listened to all the time. With voice, it's hard because you don't know, in this space there is a Google Home that's listening. And if you walk into any given space, I guess the assumption now, there's been a big shift from the assumption being that if you walk into a space that's a private space generally, to you're being listened to all the time. And I think it's different from, assuming that you're on camera, like you would maybe in like London. But I guess how do you guys feel about that? And also, do you think you'll get to a point where it becomes detrimental to not have one of these smart devices, or to not have, for example, Latch on your home? Would that actually cut people off from
I think it already
essential
is.
services?
Yeah, that's what you guys are also doing too. If you don't have these internet-connected devices, there's like, if you don't have an email address or access to, basic internet Wi-Fi, you're cut off from a large chunk of society.
Right, but like I can choose to engage with with my email to how I want to engage with that. Whereas like with voice, I don't know if I'm.
So Intersection does have a consulting group, and that's where sort of some of these statements come from. It's separate from like the Link NYC business, but it does have a consulting group that for clients looks sort of deep into technologies like this. And one of the things that we saw looking at them is, first of all, like each one of these platforms is completely paranoid about security. So when you look at the way this platform is segmented and the way that they allow an app on the platform to get access to it, it's very, very slow and small how much they reveal out. So for example, like Siri, it's very, like you have to install an app on the device for Siri. I think there's very little that app developers could do with Siri. Alexa, there's more stuff that you can do, but every app has to be opted into by the owner. That doesn't speak to the concern of like, well, Amazon has all of your voice. But, when you buy that, the person's making a choice. I guess to your point, if you go to a space, maybe you didn't buy it, but someone else bought it.
Right.
But those companies are definitely very terrified of somehow the privacy getting wrong and this whole thing, being shut down. But the trend that I have been seeing is that it's slowly sort of, they're trying to find the right ways of opening up in the right balance. And some of the problems are probably there probably are some technical problems that are more CPU related, like, can they if they could ship a voice model to the devices and do all of the listening on the edge, I think companies would be happy to do so, mainly to sort of remove the risk of that recognition, of having to store that recognition on other servers or move it around. Like those things represent risks to the Amazons and the Googles or the Apples, and I think they would very much prefer to keep it on the edge if they could.
I was just going to say, I don't know if you want to keep on the voice thing, but the one thing,
Anywhere you want.
one thing that I've seen from 2017 is the availability now of low cost, low power cellular chips. So you can now buy a cellular chip in Asia for less than $15. That used to be like $40.
Can you describe what a cellular chip
Cellular
is?
so allow basically data connection, that your IT device can connect to like AT&T or Verizon's data, which means that you don't need Wi-Fi. Like Wi-Fi does not solve a lot of problems. Like you've got like agricultural, industrial applications, even even in the home. Like why does everything have to connect to your Wi-Fi? Like I don't want to set it up. Blah blah blah. Cars as well. So you've got like Teslas, etc. And historically, those chips have been really expensive and like high power. Now you can get, as like Apple Watch announced, cellular, so you can like talk on your watch if you want to. But I think the low-cost cellular chips is really like, for me, the big paradigm shift between last year and this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another one of the paradigm shifts that we saw recently was in computer vision. There have been rapid advancements in, I'm not a computer vision expert, but there have been rapid advancements in transfer learning, such that if you wanted to train a model to recognize a particular person's face, like to provide access to a building, instead of having to have many, many models of that particular person's face, you could use a corpus of face detection to build a general face detection neural network. And then there's a technique of transfer learning where then you take that neural network, then you train it so that it specifically recognizes a few people. We've built prototypes looking at that for an access scenario, and they're not 100% accurate, but they're much more accurate than previously. And that type of approach, that kind of transfer learning approach, it's not just facial recognition, but there are many kinds of sort of ways that vision, like computer vision, has definitely advanced a lot in the last year or so.
So it sounds like a lot of what we're talking about centers on privacy and privacy issues already. Alan, I was curious, you and I were talking just before we sat down, and you were talking about HIPAA compliance, which of course Wellinks needs to abide by the HIPAA compliance guidelines or laws. What have you seen that's been new with respect to HIPAA compliance in tech?
Yeah, so there's actually been a lot of new movement. So, I mean, HIPAA compliance, just to give you guys the crash course, it's like the Health Information Portability, Privacy and Portability Act or something like that. And it's actually organized under the Office of Civil Liberties. And it's essentially, it deals with patient information and privacy. And a lot of it actually has to do with access to patient data, so patients getting access to their own medical records, and then being able to control who shares that medical record, who sees it, who has access to it, and who's able to add to it. And so it's really about, one, it's about empowering patients, it's about giving them access to their own data, and it's about making sure that it doesn't get shared with people who shouldn't have access to that data. And so one of the main concerns with HIPAA information is that an employer gets a hold of medical records for an employee and uses that to base a decision on whether or not to hire that person. That's kind of one of the examples that they point to. So with HIPAA, the problem with it is that most people who deal with any sort of patient information has to deal with HIPAA. But HIPAA was written in an age when all the medical records were on paper, and things were faxed, and things were mailed. And so there's a lot of holdovers from there, and so it was very slow to adapt to electronic medical records. It was very slow to adapt to devices coming online that are collecting data and storing data. And so, there's a lot of things that categorize something as HIPAA data. There is actually kind of a weird gray area where a patient can do whatever they want with their own data. So for example, like on your phone, on the app, like on the Notes app, you can write down all of your health information, and Apple or Google or Android doesn't have to be liable. That's not a health record. But if the doctor sends you your health record, like for example, if they email you your health record for whatever reason, that email provider is liable for that.
I have a loaded question to ask you.
Yeah.
I think it's, I don't want to be too loaded, but do you think HIPAA is actually sort of stop progress in healthcare with sharing information?
It makes it a huge pain in the butt to do anything.
Yeah.
But, so I personally believe in regulation because I think there are a lot of things that happen that were terrible that happen in an unregulated space. And I think there are a lot of people who get hurt by companies running around in unregulated spaces. I do think execution-wise HIPAA is not ideal, and I do think it needs to be fixed. And I think there are a lot of people who realize that. But when you're dealing with healthcare, when you're dealing with like human lives, that's something that I'm okay to take. I think there is a balance to be struck, and I don't think we found it. But yeah, no, it's something that I struggle, and it's the same with FDA. But I do think they are making progress. I know that recently they've been taking a step back from some of their kind of more absurd requirements. So, you have to do a risk assessment. So you go through a list of like, where is your data stored, and what is the danger of any one of these risks happening, and how does that compromise your data? And that can be anything from, someone leaves data up on the screen, like a doctor opens your program and they display patient data on their screen and they walk away from the screen and someone walking by sees it. That's a breach of patient health information. All the way to, the eastern seaboard falls into the sea and all the data centers are destroyed and patients no longer have access to that health record data. And the risk assessment is like you go through each of those and you figure out like how do you mitigate that risk. And at one point, we had to have like redundant data centers. We had to pay a lot extra to ensure on AWS that that all the data was being in one facility, like that all the servers that our data was stored on were in one secured facility, which like that's not how cloud storage works, right? It's all distributed. And so you pay a lot more extra to do that, which also means that you need like redundant location backups, which makes it a lot more expensive. They've scaled back on that a lot. And so now they're like, okay, if it's encrypted at rest, then you're fine. And so they've definitely scaled back on that a lot, which I think makes it a lot easier for us.
This is sort of related to the privacy question, but some of the applications of these technologies that we were most excited about were ones that were not incredibly personal. So I think it's very interesting, maybe there's a screen or a kiosk that you approach, and it doesn't know who you are, but it does know that there's a person standing in front of it. And maybe it can tell the mood of the person. And knowing those things, you might be able to make a better interface or a more helpful interface. Because as someone approaches, you might display more detailed directions for how to use the system. And I think that there's a lot of applications to these same kinds of vision and listening technologies that are not necessarily about knowing the identity or specific things about a person that would actually invade their privacy, but instead make the systems interact with people in a more humane way. In the same way that if you approached an information desk, the person working that information desk can infer many things about how you're feeling, what kind of day you're having, what you're trying to get done, and I think that all systems should be as responsive to those cues as people are. And I think to me those are the more interesting applications of those kinds of technologies than the ones where I identify your voice and I know where you're walking and I follow you all over the city. Like that's not there are people trying to do that kind of thing, but those are not the sort of more interesting community-based or humane transformations of spaces.
I completely agree. Yeah, like all of that, you're volunteering to talk to these machines and kind of they can help you with a better user experience. But also, we've been searching our most private things in browsers, and that is being sold to advertisers, anonymously. But you're being targeted for hemorrhoid cream, you're being targeted for all these things. Like Amazon can know. I think there was some weird stat that Amazon knows you're pregnant 2 weeks before just based on your search habits. That stuff is way more private than almost play, I don't know, Simon and Garfunkel a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, that thing is always listening, and you're searching for really intimate stuff without even thinking about it anymore. So maybe voice will become that way, where you don't even think about what you're saying. But when you say something, you definitely have a lot more. It's like a different interaction. You know, you're vocalizing your thoughts. It's like almost therapy. Like you think about it a little bit. Some people more than others when it comes out of their mouth. They think a little bit more. So.
Sai, it's the name of your company is Latch, and it's really easy to fall into the trap of thinking that your company really is based on smart locks. But you told me that that is not the focus of your company, and your description of Latch made no mention of smart locks.
Yes.
So clear the air for us.
Yeah, sure. The reason I don't talk about smart locks, two reasons. One is we feel that a lot of the more and more locks now over the next 2 years are going to say that you can unlock with your phone, and those are smart locks. And we feel that that is somewhat of a, and this is not derogatory, it's somewhat of a gadget segment. We don't really care about that it's a lock. It's just, and we don't just make locks. We make readers that go on front doors and like garage entry. We just make the hardware to create the infrastructure. So what we really care about is the infrastructure, which enables the experience. And that's why I mostly just talk about the experience. But we do make smart locks, and we make digital hardware products that allow people to share access with their friends and family when they're not around. So today, my friend had to drop something off at my apartment. I just sent him a code. He can just get in easily. My handy cleaner comes in whenever they want. My deliveries from Walmart and Jet also enter my building without me having to do anything. But again, there's all the experiences, and we build the software and hardware, and we do the full stack. But that's the reason why we don't talk about it, because the same thing, we don't say that we make an app. I mean, we do that, but in 5 years we may decide that actually we actually want the lock to scan your iris and let you in biometrically, in which case we will no longer have an app. We're basically hardware and software agnostic. That's the word. Yeah.
Okay.
But we do make a lock that's smart.
I mean, there are also other experiences I can see being congruent with that. I mean, sort of, we got excited about ideas like, as you see like an authorized person approach the property, you could trigger off a whole set of preparation steps, such that your experience through a space may be orchestrated and prepared because the latch reader at the front recognizes that this is someone who's authorized to come in, and that can get correlated with these are the types of services they want to use when they enter this space. And then all of that could be set up so that that person's experience as they pass through the space is like, this store was ready for them, this restaurant was ready for them, this movie theater was ready for them, and there's ways that you can use these, that's with identity, but there's ways that you can use these experiences to sort of kind of create kind of more fluid, right? One of the things we're looking at is experience packages and spaces, and how we can use technologies like Latch to empower a space to provide a better experience to their guests.
Yeah. Once you're on the door to someone's home and office space, you become part of the infrastructure of their life and the physical space. And once you own that infrastructure, you can enable quite wonderful experiences. So that's why I think of it more of like we're trying to create like an app store of access. We just don't know what the apps are yet. We're just still building the app store.
Okay.
I'm curious, are there any really cool things in biometric scanning that you've come across recently? Or like where are we going to end up with biometric scanning? What's the way that we're going to?
So it's a great question. We actually stay away from biometric, and they're liable for the.
Yeah, they're liable for it, right?
So
It's
they
offloaded.
put a lot of money into
And they do a
that.
great job at it. I mean,
Yeah.
are we going to be better at Face ID than Apple? Like,
Yeah.
we hired one of their engineers who did Face ID. That doesn't mean we're going to like,
Yeah.
So it's a great question, man.
Andrew, I'm curious, because Makerbot has been around a long time, as you said, 9 years, right? And so there certainly wasn't the buzzword IoT back then, even though there were probably things that were connected to the internet. So how has product design evolved over the last several years as IoT and IoT-capable devices have been more in demand? Like, for example, we want to print, 3D print things that are now connected?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, when we started, we didn't have none of these devices were connected to the internet. It was sort of a thing that we down. Here's the thing: we have a thing that's connected to the internet where you can download a thing and print a thing on a thing that's connected to the internet. Like
Yeah.
it's a really weird meta thing.
Connected
Like,
to a thing.
It's crazy to a thing. Like we have, and it's still. I still think we're. There's obvious use cases for a lot of things, like smart, not to say smart lexing, I'm sorry, but like, that's true.
It's okay.
Or
Above
kiosks like
average
that.
intelligence.
Above average intelligence. Yeah, gifted lux.
Gifted lux.
Above average. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I shouldn't be in marketing. But like this tool, now everyone's looking at everything like, how can I make this a smart thing? And we actually had some engineers who were sort of left over that was like a terrible idea to do that, to have this thing connected. That's supposed to be like this private makerspace thing. And we also have some clients that are like, that has Wi-Fi chips on it. Like, I mean, there's huge companies, there's DoD companies that are like, we can't have this thing ever connected to the internet. And like, sort of balancing that like carrot and stick of like, you really should use this product for that. But with the connected devices, you can, like some crazy things open up. Like you can connect to your manufacturer in China, and you guys could both start a print at the same time when the prototype's done. And then two people across the globe with a connected internet device can share data, not just video, voice, but also 3D data and send it over there, and you guys can both hold something and have a conversation. So there's some really, really cool opportunities about straight off the question a little bit too. But it's getting, I think you're seeing more and more of that being adopted in the space. Same thing with CAD and SolidWorks, like you see some of those old ex-founders went to find Onshape. And it's a very, engineering and that stuff is very slow to sort of get online. So there's a lot of like IP protection and that kind of thing that is very, very risky. So yeah, I think I answered that. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think you did answer it.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
I want to take a minute. I, of course, have more questions because I always have more questions. But I'd like to hear from all of you, just based on what you've heard and these panelists' various expertise. What kind of questions do we have? Sure, right here. And then.
Hi everybody, my name's Jose. I'm actually a hackathon organizer, so we encourage folks to generate the next generation of IoT practice through our hackathons. And Ellen, you talked about earlier about HIPAA compliance, how they finally scaled it back after they realized like, okay, it's just cost prohibitive, it's killing the innovation. And I think a big barrier actually is the fact that, there's a big disconnect between the uninformed public as well as the politicians and the actual innovation that's happening. So what's being done to like bridge that gap? Because technology is always way ahead of the law, and while the law struggles to catch up, I think it's a big responsibility of us that are in the know to like keep them well informed.
So I'm sorry. So what's the question?
What are you doing to educate?
To educate.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'll just kind of jump in, like a lot of Intersection and Link NYC, those are municipal franchises. We also have franchise agreements with transit authorities. So we deal with with situations where, we're working with government agencies that are, as you put, like they're not as technical, they're not as aware. And I think our guiding line is to be more disciplined than any regulation would begin to, so we have a strong commitment to privacy, we have we have a vision of the future of advertising that is explicitly not minority report, it's a broadcast medium, and it's kind of, and that gets baked into all of the things that we build, so part of what we try to do is to sort of, go beyond what, kind of objections or policy issues that they might have, and be a responsible actor in the space. And help, and sort of gain their trust as a partner in creating, responsible experiences in public space. And that's definitely the way that Intersection approaches, working with those kinds of stakeholders. And it's been essential to, winning things like Link NYC. Otherwise, if we weren't, completely proactive, it would be much harder to get these kinds of things deployed.
Thanks, Patrick. Ellen, different set of regulations, different
Yeah.
space.
I
What
mean,
do you
so I think one thing is that the industry is slow to move in healthcare. They do take some cues from consumer devices, and so you see these wearables coming online. You see Fitbit, being in clinical studies. You see the FDA sort of sitting up and taking notice and saying like, okay, do we need to regulate this? And then they finally back off. And the FDA is now realizing, like, I'm going down to the FDA on Monday for a day-long session about orthopedic smart sensors. And like they're actually hosting this, and they're bringing in academic researchers, they're bringing in the leaders of the field. And so it's a combination of, one, you have to find the right people in the industry, so you have to find the people who have influence in industry, either in academia or in industry. Some of it, you know, as much as I hate to say this, you have to rely on the kind of like the very large medical device companies to start to think about that, because, you know, they have divisions within their companies that are looking ahead to the future, you know, what's coming down the pipeline in the next 10, 20 years. Everything in healthcare takes so long that you have people who are constantly looking, you know, decades ahead to figure out what are the next things that we need to work on now that will come onto the market 5 to 10 years in the future. But you realize that like innovation is happening at a blistering pace right now, and they're realizing that they can't keep doing that. Their cycles need to go a lot faster. And so, you know, I think we have good people right now at the FDA who realize, like, you know, if you look at these software regulations for FDA, like medically regulated software is hugely prohibitive, just in the way that they're written, just in the way that things are written, where like every revision has to go through approval, and like every revision has to be signed off, and you fix a bug, and that's another release, and that's another, and like that has to be reviewed, and that's extremely prohibitive, and that's not how software development works, and especially not now. And so, you know, they're realizing this, and they're actually backing off, and they're saying, like, we're actually going to take a new look at this, and we actually are identifying gray areas where, you know, rather than having like a systematic top-down approach of like, this is how you need to work from a systems perspective, they say like, here are some applications, like here are some examples of applications that are in this gray area. So for example, you know, they identified a gray area of a mobile app that connects to a device where the mobile app communicates to patients and sends information to a doctor, which is precisely where we fall. And they said, you know, this is something that will exercise discretion in. It's not completely regulated, it's not completely risk-free, but, you know, we'll take these on a case-by-case basis. And I think there is more flexibility there, but you know, it's getting involved on a policy level. It's like going to these things that the FDA is hosting so that they can hear your feedback. And they will put out, you know, and the government, at least in healthcare, a lot of your funding is coming from grants. And so if you're applying for grants, you have to talk to the people who are submitting the grants. And the grant process is they'll put out an open call for grants, like for funding proposals, but you actually talk to them beforehand. So they'll have these meetings before they put out these proposals or calls for proposals where you tell them like what you're thinking about proposing, and they'll say like, okay, that's interesting, like that's an interesting thing to be thinking about. And so you actually have an opportunity to direct what they're thinking about. And then when they put out, they're like, okay, we're funding these opportunities. Those opportunities are pulled from what people were telling them in the initial meetings. And so, you know, it's one of those things where you don't just have to sit with whatever comes down from the top of the pipeline. It's like, find the people who are making those decisions, talk to the program directors of these things, and convince them that what you're doing is important, and also that, it might be worth taking a look at some of the policies that are actually preventing you from doing these really cool things.
Okay, thanks. I think we had a question over here.
Hi, Drake. This is directed towards you. What you're doing in the intersection is really amazing, giving everyone Wi-Fi. My question is, what are you doing with security? Because I've actually heard of many instances where people can hack into other people's phones just doing the same open network.
So the security question is like a complex and multifaceted one. It's one that Intersection cares about a great deal. There are networking things that you can do to try to make sure that the networks of the different connectors, that they're on separate networks. There are also other things like, we just released phone apps to try to help make the process of connecting to the secured Wi-Fi easier to do. Each of the Link NYC has 2 Wi-Fi connections, one of which is a public, an unsecured one, and another one which is a secured one. The process of getting that key, that certificate, and upgrading it was fairly complex, so we're trying to make tooling around so that people using the Wi-Fi are more automatically connected to the secure option. And then just also the security question is like it sort of permeates the organization. I mean, we have a security group that audits the organization. We have pen tests that go on through the organization. another example that I used earlier was like we've stopped using, wherever we can, we've stopped using email internally, and we're trying to use things like Slack more because of the way that phishing is so easy on email, and the less time people spend on email, the lower your risk is to those types of attacks. So like security is it's a multifaceted topic with a lot of different, it's not my specialty, but I know that there's like a lot of different angles that we come at it with. And, it's one that, it's sort of constantly taken very seriously. How, and also constantly improve, like how can we make this more secure? How can we make this stronger? It's sort of to the point of like, I think if you're working with the public in some way, or if you're working with patients, or you're working, you can't just, you can't stay at doing the minimum. Like you have to keep improving and sort of strive to always be doing the thing that's in the best interest of the people working with your system. And you just have to make those investments proactively as part of your identity and part of your brand. Like it has to be a part of your company that you are secure in every possible way.
Like Silicon Valley are addressing things like this, the attack of the robot. What are your greatest fears when it comes to the Internet of Things and connectivity of more devices around us?
So
I'm just worried there's going to be loads of junk in people's homes that's connected to the internet, to be honest.
Yeah.
The amount of, frankly, just stuff you see. I mean, we have some cool stuff in the office that people send us, like there's a connected flower pot. It tells you when the water's low.
That's cool.
That's cool, yeah. You seen that?
Yeah, and there's a 3D wearable one too.
It's actually quite cool. It's actually cool. We've got like basil growing. It's nice. Like connected light switches, like with OLED displays that cost like $500. A friend of ours actually runs that. It's cool, but I'm just like, I don't know who's going to pay that much. I'm just worried that there's a lot of these devices that consume energy, that connect to your Wi-Fi, and I just think there's a lot of screens, a lot of junk.
I think my fear is like two-factor authenticating to literally every device in the space. So two-factor authenticating to log in the door, two-factor authenticating to turn on the light, two-factor authenticating to open the refrigerator, two-factor authenticating to cook a burrito. It's there's a way that when you have lots of these different types of devices, and if those devices don't have a shared authentication and authorization mechanism, then it sort of stacks up and it becomes prohibitive to try to use them in a consistent way or in the way that they want to be designed, because giving permission to each one of them to talk to the other, and that being I'm less afraid of them being hacked, and I'm more afraid of the need for security kind of just making all of these devices not want to talk to anyone, and then it just being sort of like a cacophony of prove who you are before you can do anything useful.
I would say one of my concerns centers around access for, one, I would say, what are these things being trained on? Are they being trained on a diverse enough sort of number of types of people so that, you aren't being confused, or, there's lots of problems where, it has a hard time telling people part of different ethnicities or people with accents. And that's cutting off access to a lot of people. And once those things no longer become optional, once you are cut off from critical services by having these things that are internet connected, I think that becomes a concern, at least for me. And then also, you can say that these things have a 99.999% success rate, but if you are that person who has problems, technical problems, everything's going to fail at some point. Everything has to be powered. Everything needs electricity. If that gets cut off, what happens? If everything is connected to the grid, how do things stay connected if they control your access to critical services if the power goes out, for example? And so, do you need a separate infrastructure for all these things? And are all the people making these things thinking about this? And because you have a lot of different companies working on these things, you don't know, if you give access to this device, you don't know that they're necessarily going to treat your data the same as, say, Google is. They're not necessarily going to be as paranoid. And you also have a lot of devices coming online with unclear origins, right? you know, I bought a smart outlet and there were probably like 40 different companies, 40 different brand names selling the same device, and you can tell that, you know, they're all different companies in China selling it, and they're all using their own chips, and you're giving them access to your Wi-Fi network, you're giving them access to things that you're plugging in, and you're like, I have no idea who actually runs this, and this is connected to a server where I have no idea who's actually getting this data. So yeah.
That's true, there's a lot of trust in there.
Yeah.
It's like when you give someone on the street your Wi-Fi password,
Yeah.
like, yeah, have fun. But you give like something you bought off eBay from
Yeah.
Alibaba or something, yeah, sure, you can look on, get the Wi-Fi, cool.
Yeah.
It's scary.
I know we got a question back there.
Yeah, so question is more about, so it feels like right now we're sort of at, you know, we talk about the Internet of Things in the same way as I remember sort of 1996, 97, you know, we talked about the Internet versus the web. And so do you see a future when we're moving more toward the web of things where it's just a given that things are sort of connected and there's maybe a standard, sort of the HTML of things where things, there's a standard of way of communicating. So I guess my question is, where do you see sort of the future, some thoughts on the future of where this all is going, and is it scary or is it exciting or what's, you know?
That's a great question.
Yeah, well, yeah, take a crack at it.
Um,